One of the hyena's teeth tore into Akela's shoulder, but he barely felt the physical pain. What crushed him was the humiliation of being an alpha reduced to carrion. He was a living legend of those mountains, a wolf whose howl once silenced the forest, but now he was just a trembling body on the dirty snow. The hyenas, opportunistic and cruel, formed a ring of yellow teeth around him. They sensed that the great wolf was broken, but there was something that confused them. Akela had no visible wounds that justified such weakness. He tried to steady his front paws for one last attack, but a violent spasm threw him back onto the ice. There was a dark secret hidden beneath the thick fur of his neck, something that pulsed and drained him with every heartbeat, a mark he hid even from himself. Akela looked up at the gray sky, smelling his own death, wondering how the king of those lands had become a prisoner of his own body. The circle tightened. The leader of the hyenas leaped for the final blow, aiming at the wolf's exposed throat, when the impossible happened. The ground did not tremble with footsteps, but with an explosion of dry branches. Two enormous bears, whose silhouettes looked like mountains of dark fur, emerged from the mist. They were not hunting, they were protecting. With a roar that made Akela's bones vibrate, the bears swept the hyenas away as if they were dry leaves, a behavior that defied all the laws of nature. In the midst of the chaos, Akela felt a different presence. Silas, a man who lived isolated on that wild frontier, approached with slow steps. He did not carry a spear, but a pair of heavy pliers and a look of deep guilt. As he touched the wolf's neck, Silas discovered the terrible truth. A thin steel cable, almost invisible, was buried in Akela's flesh, tightening around his trachea with every attempt to growl. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave in the comments what you thought of the story and which city or country you're watching the video from. Silas felt the tremor beneath Akela's skin, a vibration that mixed terror and an ancestral resistance. The wolf, even on the edge of the abyss, still tried to bare his teeth, but the steel wire acted like an invisible hand tightening around his throat. While the bears kept the hyenas at bay in a ballet of growls and swipes, the man realized that this was no ordinary accident. The metal snare had a specific lock, a sophisticated mechanism used only by a group Silas knew all too well, the Iron Sentinels. They were not ordinary hunters seeking food. They were men who profited from suffering, setting traps that did not kill immediately, but turned proud predators into wandering shadows so they could be captured alive and sold on the black market. The hyenas, on the other hand, seemed possessed by an abnormal persistence. They did not retreat in the face of the bears, as if something beyond hunger was driving them. Silas noticed that the leader of the pack wore a worn leather collar, a detail that Akela had also perceived in his delirium of pain. The connection between the invaders and the sentinels became clear. The hyenas were the criminals' guard dogs, released to locate prey caught in traps. The conflict there was not just between species. It was a war between wild freedom and industrial cruelty. Akela, watching Silas with eyes that shifted between living amber and dull gray, began to understand that this human was not his executioner, but perhaps the only being who held the key to his liberation, although the smell of metal in the man's hand still made him hesitate. As Silas struggled to stabilize the wolf and cut the cable without causing a fatal hemorrhage, the hyenas began to change tactics. Instead of direct attacks, they started to circle in absolute silence, communicating through signals that defied animal logic. One of them approached Silas from behind, ignoring the wolf, focused entirely on the human. The danger escalated as the snow began to fall again, covering the pack's intentions. The mystery of why Silas lived so isolated and how he knew the techniques of those hunters so well hung in the air, as dense as the cold that threatened to freeze Akela's blood before the first tool could be used. Time seemed to have frozen in the clearing, but inside Silas, A frantic race against death was accelerating. He knew the pliers in his hands were insufficient for the task, as the steel used by the Iron Sentinels was reinforced with titanium alloys. Akela, sensing the human's hesitation, let out a low whimper, a sound that was not of pain, but of an almost rational urgency. The wolf fixed his gaze on a crevice beneath a nearby rock, where the ice shimmered differently. Silas followed the animal's gaze and understood. The wolf was not merely waiting for death in that place. He had hidden something there. Digging frantically through the snow, the man found an old communication radio, partially destroyed, but with its battery still emitting a faint pulse. The mystery of how that object had gotten there began to unravel in Silas's mind. Akela had been observing the hunters for months, stealing their equipment and sabotaging their plans long before he was caught. The wolf was the true guardian of the mountain, and the trap around his neck had been the price for his defiance. Silas, using the radio's circuits and the friction of the stones, began to improvise a chemical superheater to weaken the metal of the snare. Meanwhile, Akela, in a supernatural effort, began to move his body slowly, positioning himself not to escape, but to offer a better angle for Silas's work. The animal now entrusted his entire life to that man who, in the past, might have been one of those who spread terror. The preparation was tense and silent. Silas worked with fingers bleeding from the cold, while the bears, exhausted from constant defense, began to retreat to the edge of the forest. The hyenas noticed the giant's weakness and launched a coordinated assault. Silas knew he would not have a second chance. He applied the chemical mixture to the steel cable, watching the effervescent reaction that began to corrode the metal. Akela felt the heat at his neck and, instead of pulling away, pressed his trachea against the chemical fire, showing a courage that made Silas's hands stop trembling. They were no longer strangers. They were two survivors preparing the strike that would change the fate of those mountains forever, as the sound of ATV engines began to echo in the distance, announcing that the hyenas' masters were arriving. The roar of engines cut through the air like a metallic thunderclap, announcing the arrival of the Iron Sentinels. 3 ATVs emerged at the edge of the clearing, their LED lights momentarily blinding Akela. The leader of the hunters, a man with his face hidden behind a neoprene mask, jumped off the vehicle with an electric spear, ready to claim his trophy. He laughed when he saw Silas kneeling in the snow, believing the hermit was simply waiting for the end. But what the hunters did not see was the crimson glow at the wolf's neck. Silas's chemical superheater had reached its ignition point. With a snap that sounded like a rifle shot, the steel cable gave way, splitting in two and freeing the giant's trachea. Air rushed into Akela's lungs with explosive force. The wolf did not flee. He became a blur of gray fury. In a movement that defied biology, Akela leaped at the leader of the hunters before he could even activate the spear. The reversal was complete. The hyenas, seeing their master being overpowered, hesitated, and that opening was all the bears needed to resume the offensive. Silas, revealing his true identity as a former engineer of the group who now sought redemption, used a modified radio to emit a high-voltage frequency. The sound, inaudible to humans but unbearable to the trained hyenas, caused the pack of predators to collapse, fleeing toward the forest in blind panic. Justice was carried out with surgical precision. Akela did not kill the masked man. He disarmed him and pinned him against the snow, growling just inches from his face until the terror in the hunter's eyes became absolute. Silas quickly used the remains of the steel traps to restrain the other two criminals to their own ATVs. The wolf, now free from the anchor that had been killing him, remained standing over the fallen leader, a monument to the resilience of nature. The Iron Sentinel's dominion over that region ended in that very moment. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by the sound of snow falling over the now useless metal. as Akela felt, for the first time in months, that his blood flowed free and powerful through his veins. As the sun began to break through the icy mist, Akela's authority was restored, but the final challenge had not yet been overcome. The hunters were left for the environmental authorities that Silas had alerted through the recovered radio signal, marking the end of a cycle of exploitation that had nearly extinguished hope on that mountain. However, the wolf now carried the scent of man and medicine, an invisible mark that could be his death sentence in the wild. When Akela approached the borders of his former territory, the silence of the forest was heavy with judgment. The rest of his pack emerged from between the tree trunks, led by a young and vigorous male who now held the position of alpha. They did not see the hero who had survived steel. They saw only a stranger who carried with him the odor of humanity. The tension was almost tangible as the young alpha growled, preparing to drive the veteran away. Silas watched from a distance, his heart tight, knowing that his help might have cost Akela what he loved most, belonging. But the unexpected happened. An elderly female, bearing the marks of past battles, walked to the center of the circle. She sniffed the scar on Akela's neck, recognizing not the smell of metal, but the essence of the wolf who had once protected her. With a gesture of submission, she pressed her muzzle against Akela's chest, and one by one, the other members of the pack followed her example, recognizing the king who had returned from the world of the dead. Belonging was not a matter of scent, but of history and loyalty. Akela looked at Silas one last time, a look of silent gratitude that sealed an eternal bond between two worlds. The wolf returned home, no longer as a victim, but as living proof that compassion can repair what greed tried to destroy. The lesson that remains is that no trap is strong enough to imprison a spirit that refuses to give up and that finds allies where it least expects. If this journey of overcoming has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave in the comments what you thought of the story and which city or country you were watching the video from.